Hello, everyone, and thank you so much for coming to our first session of the new term of CEN seminars. So today we are joined by Dr. Jennie Grammer. So Jennie is an associate professor of education in the School of Education and Information Studies at UCLA, and she studies how experiences at school shape children's cognitive development and learning. She's also the faculty director of the UC CSU Collaborative for Neuroscience, Diversity and Learning, which was established by the state of California in 2022 to bridge research, educator preparation, and policy to improve educational experiences for neurodiverse learners. So Jennie gave a wonderful keynote lecture earlier this summer at the International Mind, Brain and Education Society conference, and I'm very much looking forward to hearing more of what she has to tell us about executive functioning today. So I will hand over to Jennie.
Thank you so much, Astrid. I'm excited to be here, and I'm excited. Unfortunately, I can't see everybody, but I'm excited to have conversation with you all once I've completed this talk. As was mentioned, I presented something similar at IMBIS this summer. So if you happen to be at IMBIS, this might seem familiar to you. I put our logo up there. I'm also the incoming president of IMBIS, so always making a plug, and you'll see as I go through some references to articles in Mind, Brain Education that are worth checking out if you haven't already. So today, what I'm going to talk about is how thinking about the study of executive function and attention in school has shaped my thinking about how we measure these skills, how we might be thinking about them in the context of application for education. And so we'll dig in. I'm going to start with a little bit of a background on what I do broadly. So as was mentioned in the introduction, my primary area of work, or my body of work, is focused on how experiences that children have in school promote the emergence and refinement of their cognitive skills. So we know that school experience, just going to school, changes children's cognitive skills. And a part of what I've been trying to understand through my work are the ways that that happens, like what are the mechanisms for change. We also know that there are vast individual differences in skills associated with attention and self-regulation when children enter school, and in the trajectories that those skills take across development. But my work is guided by the premise that all young people, regardless of their background or learning needs, deserve access to high-quality educational and instructional experiences. And really, I hope to contribute to understanding how to do this with respect to cognition. Now, whenever I start off talks like this, I always also kind of want to orient people to how I think about things, kind of the developmental science framework that I work in. So I'm very focused on how we think about children, their development in context. And one of the things that is important to just be reminded of is that expectations for children's and adults' behavior are derived from the social environment that we're in. And so here on this slide, you can see pictures of different learning environments. And so on the one hand, we have a group of pre-K learners. They're engaged in something it's a learning activity. It's a game, a puzzle game, right? But what self-regulation looks like in this age and in this environment is quite different than when we fast forward to kids being, say, third and fourth grade, sitting in desks and in rows. And then fast forward even further, these are college students in a lecture hall, right? So we all know what we're supposed to do when we're in class to pay attention, what it looks like to pay attention, for example. But those norms are set by the context that we're in. And we think that those contexts are also what's driving development. In part of my work, I focus on kind of the neural correlates of these skills. I'm not going to go into too much about that today, although I'll kind of, as we round through, I'll talk about some of our EEG work in real-world learning environments. But just want to note that we see developmental changes in behavior. They're complemented by changes that are happening in the brain. And changes in our environments, right? So we have these windows of time that we think are pretty important for transitions in brain development that are aligned with changes in the environments that kids are in. And so we can look at the infancy period, these kind of early childhood, pre-K years, elementary school and middle school and beyond, right? So these important windows of development. But again, the context that kids are in and our expectations of children's behavior are changing pretty dramatically across these different settings and periods of development. So in my work, I'm really interested in studying executive functions and attention through a couple of different channels. So working to just characterize development, changes in brain, changes in behavior that we might be observing, linking executive function and attention with processes that matter in school. So things like academic achievement, for example, and then exploring the impact of school experience on the development. Now, as I look at this kind of these three goals, most of the time in my work, I'm doing a couple of things at once. I might be doing classroom observations and linking those classroom observations to changes in what's happening in brain activity that we're measuring, say, through EEG. I might be looking at behavior and brain activity together, but I use multiple methods in most of the studies that I conduct. Now, I think that it's interesting empirically for me to study some of these basics, like how does development happen? What does it look like? How does the development of attention relate to changes in reading skills, for example? But really, the core question is, what about school experience matters? Because at the end of the day, we want to be able to make this work relevant and have some kind of translation. So I would also say, and I know that I probably focus on this in a slightly different way than others do, but I really do think a lot about what we have to share with educators. I was mentioning before we got on this call that I was doing a professional development a couple of weeks ago, and so often I can go through my talk about this are executive functions and this is what it looks like, but what that actually means to educators and what they're seeing every day often hasn't always been as well aligned as I'd like. So, even if the work that we're doing right now doesn't have immediate translational impact, the question is, somewhere down the road, what will we be able to say about these skills in classroom settings and what educators should know about them and what they might be able to do to support their development? We'll come back to this idea, but I just wanted to kind of start with that, plant that seed. But we're going to dig into some definitions and terms first, because I feel like that's a helpful grounding also for talks about executive function in particular. And this talk really comes from a discussion or a kind of a chapter that I wrote with my postdoc mentor, Fred Morrison, over a decade ago now. And it is going to serve for the framing for the rest of the talk here. So the chapter was titled Conceptual Clutter and Measurement Mayhem, and proposals for cross-disciplinary integration in conceptualizing and measuring executive function. I think that sets the stage also for those of you kind of wondering, well, what is she talking about when she's talking about executive function? Because in every talk that I have attended, there's a slightly different definition. You might have had the same experience. So how do I personally define executive function? I'm going to use the definition that we used in the chapter just here. So when I'm talking about executive function, I'm talking about cognitive skills that are utilized for purposeful, future-oriented behavior that underlie flexible adaptation to changing task demands, including the regulation of attention. And so there comes our attentional piece, inhibition of inappropriate responses, and the coordination of information and working memory. Now, I know that in some cases you might include some of these skills. Some of you might not include working memory, for example, in your core definition of executive functions. We could get in the weeds of this, but we'll start there. As we're talking about executive functions, this is how I'm thinking about it. But if you have been immersed in the study of executive functions for a long time, you also know that there's a lot of things going on in this field. So, and part of it comes from the different disciplines that we are deriving the study of executive function from. So we have a lot of ways of describing executive function. If you are in the neuroscience field, you might be thinking about cognitive control or separable component skills. In psychology, you might have been historically using terms like central executive. Maybe now you're talking about executive functions. There's even more. We'll get to them. In education, we've talked about things like work-related skills. You might also use terms like executive attention, effortful control, executive control, self-regulation, behavioral regulation. We talk about these skills as being hot sometimes and cold in other times. And then we have metaphors that we use, the idea of an air traffic control system, or these kind of metaphors for flipping your lid and controlling your top-down, bottom-up processes, right? So this, again, that kind of hot and cold reference around regulation. Now, this proliferation of terms is part of what we were going after when we wrote the chapter a decade ago. But we also have not just a lot of terms, we also have a lot of different models. So is it one executive function? Is it multiple components of executive function? And we could go into the weeds on this for days. We won't do that here, but I think that this is, for those of us who are thinking about the research, where we live a lot of the times, right? This is kind of how we're thinking about things. And I love this paper that came out in Mind Brain Education in February of this year. I asked for permission, but I have here stolen this image to kind of demonstrate the complexities of describing EF. And I think that it's really, even 10 years on, there's a real need for formal description of cognitive processes and the relations among them. Kind of the sense that we're still in the world of having a lot of kind of confusion around what we're talking about. And depending on my lens and my framework, I might be calling the same elephant very different things. And so you might look at this and recognize your own work or the things that you are interested in reflected here. And I think that this is something that it's not a new issue. A lot of people have been thinking about this. But it makes our work and the translation of our work a lot more challenging. I think in this paper that Sylvia wrote, she highlights that there are 39 psychological labels for executive function processes. That's a lot. And maybe they're not adding to our specificity that we might want to have. So this is our conceptual clutter. We also have measurement mayhem, as we described it in the chapter. So we've got, from neuroscience, our cache of measures. I use, as I mentioned before, electrophysiology to look at the neural correlates of executive functions and attention. In education, we often rely on observations or teacher or parent report. So these kind of behavioral but observational tools. And in psychology, we often use single tasks, right? So we use behavioral tasks, and these tasks are meant to kind of get at specific component processes of executive function. And sometimes, like I do in my work, I use 2 or 3 of these types of things at once. But measuring executive function is incredibly complicated, which also makes the work of translating a lot more challenging. So if we were to put it on a continuum, for the same skill, I might have neuroscientific tasks, my lab tasks, my teacher and parent report. And in our work, we also have these classroom games that we've developed where it's kind of like a riff on some of our lab tasks, but that we play with kids in real world settings so we can get at the peer impact. Because a lot of times, I don't know if you've ever played, I don't know, I'm trying to think of a type of game like that you might play in a group. But if you were to take a head, toes, knees, shoulders type of activity or a call and response game, a lot of times you'll see kids looking to their left and to their right to understand what to do next or what rule to follow. And so seeing how kids engage in these same processes with other kids around them has been really helpful for us to understand kind of that half step between our lab tasks and what teachers and parents are reporting. But when we're working in the world of executive function, you have to make careful choices between different levels of analysis and measurement, and kind of weigh that against the inferences that we want to make. So there are a lot of challenging issues here, but across the board, I think we're trying to get somewhere closer as we go to the left of the screen toward ecological validity, perhaps, right? And this speaks to the broader goal of thinking about how these things might be skills that we want to study that have application in the real world. But there can be challenges there. Now, another thing to note is that when we started to think about even classroom games, our goal was really to think about some of the bigger concerns we have about executive function measurement, because each of these approaches have strengths and weaknesses. So when we think about our neuroscientific tasks, we're kind of lacking in ecological validity. But when we're thinking about our teacher and parent reports, we also have this introduction of potential for bias. We know that at least teacher reports can be informed by their perceptions of student socioeconomic status, race, gender of student, right? So we might make different attributions about behavior we see that are informed by these things that we're not realizing we're accounting for. But then when we get into our lab tasks, some subtle aspects of task parameters also have a big impact on what we're measuring. So I think that these are just things to consider when we want to dig deep into that measurement component. And so that is our conceptual clutter and our measurement mayhem together. Okay. So when we wrapped up the chapter, we concluded with this statement. The past 3 decades have witnessed an explosion of scientific work across several disciplines examining children's executive control processes. Notwithstanding advances made in each field, the confusing array of constructs, conceptual clutter, and dizzying variety of assessment tools, measurement mayhem, threaten to derail efforts to derive a more unified and hence fuller understanding of the nature and development of these critical skills. Now, I would say that 10 years on, our executive function tasks are complex, involving the coordination of a number of different processes. The definitions of executive function have expanded, new constructs have been added. We have a number of compelling models for executive function, lots of discussions about them, but so now what? In our chapter, we had a couple of proposed solutions. One was exploring associations among measures of EF and self-regulation, kind of in the weeds of that. The second was examining developmental changes, which many people have done, and we have a number of really great longitudinal studies now. And then the third is considering the impact of experiences in school. And that's where I want to transition to thinking or kind of resetting that third proposal as we lead into some more of the work that my lab has been doing. So when I'm considering how we link executive function research and practice, I used to ask the question, how might issues with conceptualization and measurement impact our ability to translate research on executive function? And I still have that as a part of my framing, but if I switch it around, one of the things that we've been leaning into is how might studying executive function in the school context inform our conceptualization and measurement? So how does going into the real world actually give us more insight into what we're trying to measure in the first place? Is that a useful endeavor? Or does it further muddy the waters? It might. But to maybe give a little bit of meat around this idea, I want to give you a quick clip of a video from a classroom. And as you're watching this video, I want you to maybe focus on 1 or 2 students in this room and watch what they're doing, and also think about the moves that the teacher is making and opportunities for executive function and attention to be evidenced here. Let's take it, see if everybody can hear.
But before we get to our new sound, we might as well get a little exercise. So stand up. This is our signal. Stand up. Watch me really, really, really closely. Tiptoe to the table. Go to your spine. The first thing you're going to need are your O and I vowel sticks. And Miss Harvey put them out for us. So put your octopus in one hand and your itch in the other hand. And sit in your chairs like active listeners, and let's see which table is ready to go. I'm going to say a sound, and I want to see you put that sound in the air. Are you ready? Show me the ah. Show me the I. Show me the I. Show me the ah. Show me the ah. 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 I. Ah. Ooh. All right, let's try some harder ones.
Okay, so that gives you a sense of what might be happening just this morning here in Los Angeles in a classroom. I think this is actually a Southern classroom, if you can't tell by the accents. And I love, you can see there, I do a lot of response inhibition tasks with kids and working memory tasks with kids, but if you're watching their behavior, you see the same types of responses we actually get when we put kids into these controlled lab task types of scenarios. There are a lot of things happening here. I think even when you watch kids walk from the rug to the seat, there's a lot of variation in how we're making that progress, right? So those transitions might matter. The activity the teacher is leading may matter. And that's kind of where we want to be thinking. But also, you notice there's a ton of variability. And if you teach it or you work in classroom settings, you see this every day. So that's the real world of how these skills are being applied. And this activity, I don't know quite what to make of it, but it seems like it's fun. So there you have it. So when we think about executive functions in school, we have the sense that they're really important. Executive function and attention matters. Why do we think that is? We know that these skills have relevance for children's school readiness. We also think that they're important for learning and academic achievement. And we know that executive functions and attention are related to mental and behavioral health. This is really of interest also here for us, and I don't know how it is for you all. But we have seen, particularly post-COVID, some pretty dramatic changes, I think, in how people are seeing the behavior of kids in classrooms related to concerns about attention. But attention and executive functions are also tightly tied with symptomatology, for example, with ADHD or anxiety. And so I think this is an area that we're really, really focused on. For children with attention deficit hyperactivity disorder, the impact of inattention on educational outcomes is particularly pronounced. And in the US, individuals with ADHD are more likely to be placed in special education classes, repeat grades, and have difficulty completing high school and college. And so there's a lot of interest in understanding how to support students, particularly early on, and make sure that that the classroom environments are, I think, helping maybe with some of the challenges kids with ADHD and anxiety might be having. So one of the other things here that, especially in the context of California, that we've been considering is just it's kind of aligned with this, the numbers of diverse learners that we have in our schools. So in California, 13% of K-12 students have an identified disability related to attention and learning differences, and 1 in 5 students are estimated to experience difficulty with dyslexia, dyscalculia, ADHD, autism. Here in California, that represents about 1.2 million of California's 6 million youth. But as I mentioned, we also see challenges with executive function and attention related to anxiety, depression, and trauma. All of these impact learning. And as I said, kind of before we got into this, 80% of schools reported changes in student behavior and social emotional development in 2022 in surveys that went out kind of post-COVID as people were trying to return to kind of the post-COVID learning world. And so it's also this context that we care about, the link between executive function and the supports that might be in place in classrooms. So if we consider for a moment the experience of a student who struggles with executive function and attention, forgetting what we know about measurement and research in general, we just think about the experience of one of those kids that we saw in that video. There are a lot of factors that are influencing the expression of the behavior that they have. So if we are coming at it from a developmental science framing, when we're seeing kids in classrooms, they have difficulty with self-regulation, we're often focusing on the things that we can observe in their behavior. But if I'm talking to neuroscientists, typically we might have one story about the factors that give rise to that behavior. It may be that there's something happening in your brain, gives rise to behavior that then impacts or informs the types of placements or experiences you have in the classroom. When I talk with educators, we kind of have the opposite discussion typically, what's happening in the classroom that influences behavior that might in turn be changing brain development. And I don't know if it's the same for you all. There are a lot of schools here where there's a lot of narrative about growing your brain, which is really, really great. Obviously, both of these things are probably happening at the same time. So if you're a child who has difficulty with attention or self-regulation, that might be something that's based in, developmental differences or things that are happening in your brain or in your body, gives rise to the behavior we see. You could enter a classroom where you're working with a teacher who really sees the behavior as a challenge of self-regulation or attention or executive function. That teacher can make moves in the classroom that might support you in kind of stretching that executive function muscle. You might also be in a context where that behavior is seen as misbehavior, right? And so in that experience, a teacher might also do things that make it more challenging for you to work that executive function muscle. And so somewhere in the mix, these interactions are what gives rise to development, and this is happening over time. So it's a complex series of bidirectional interactions always that are informing development. But what does this mean for us? Broadly, we believe that there's value in understanding individual differences in executive function. We have challenges with precision in our measurement. This leads to challenges with recommendations for practice. And so I think that this piece about our conceptual clutter and our measurement mayhem makes it harder for us to say, oh yeah, this is how you would support EF development, because a lot of times we don't always have the empirical work because we're kind of living in this space of some of the challenge around the work that we're doing in the first place. So in our efforts to take executive function, the study of executive function attention to school, we've been asking a couple of main questions. What can we learn from talking with teachers about executive function and attention? What can we learn from observing in classrooms about the things that promote the development of EF? And what can we learn from using neuroscience in real-world settings that might also get us closer to understanding these processes? Okay, so I'm going to start with what can we learn from talking with teachers? And we'll go back to our elephant. And more often than not, this is the type of question that I get when I start a discussion of executive function and attention. Why can't kids just sit still? This is a great question. I've also had folks ask me, why are people so obsessed with kids sitting still? Also a valid question. But at the end of the day, the questions that we hear and the things that we're hearing from educators, we've done a number of interview studies, qualitative studies, where we're thinking about what teachers know and the sources of their knowledge around attention and executive function. So we hear things like this. This whole class is always misbehaving. I wish they had better executive function. What can I do to support executive function when I'm teaching reading, for example? This is a really common question. How can I embed executive function and attentional supports in the context of learning? How can I tell if the student has an executive function disability? That's a great question. I don't always even know what an EF disability would necessarily look like. I feel like I'm someone who should. What's the difference between executive function and self-regulation anyway? This one gets me every time. You've noticed I've been using these terms interchangeably. And I can tell you that I've faced this question in a number of discussions with teachers, and they have a lot of important reasons for asking, because a lot of times researchers like me come in and we're talking about all of our skills, but there is a foundational, like, is there a difference? Does it matter, right? And I think that that's an important one for us to consider. I'll let you think about it on your own. And also, these students have low executive function, so I can't expect them to learn fill in the blank. This one is actually really increasingly of concern to me, because more and more when I talk with people, there is this kind of sense that executive functions are kind of fixed, almost like how people have talked about IQ, whether that's the way that we should be talking about it or not. And we want to at least reset this thinking, because we consider EF skills as being something that are malleable, that can continue to develop and grow and are informed by context. And I think that this is actually where some of our neuroscience can help, but it is important to have an awareness that when we're talking about executive functions, and particularly the impact of early traumatic experiences as they relate to later executive functions and school readiness and behavior, that sometimes that narrative can turn into something that seems more fixed and more deterministic than we might want it to. But broadly, when we're talking about executive function in the elementary school classroom, we hear a lot of discussions from educators about school readiness, the links between academic achievement, and really this connection with behavior. like first and front and center. Most of the discussions and interviews that we have with educators always come back to the behavior that we see, getting out of your seat, being able to not talk out, this type of thing. So I want to highlight a study that's under review now, conducted by one of my graduate students, Zoe Mao, where she interviewed educators in Shanghai. And she has this great quote from one of the teachers that she interviewed: paying attention gets twice the result with half the effort. She interviewed teachers who teach in pre-kindergarten to kindergarten. And in talking with them about attention, she asked questions like, how do you know students are paying attention? And the main way that they talked about this was by observing behavior, thinking about students' gaze, their body movement, the completion of tasks, the persistence they observed. And when asking teachers why are some students more or less attentive, she found these interesting patterns of educators talking about different internal factors like neurodiversity, children's temperament, versus external factors. This focus on classroom supports and moves the teachers themselves could make that would support kids' executive function and attention in that moment, but also hopefully set a good foundation for them as they're transitioning into schooling. This is a slightly different narrative than we hear when we talk with teachers in the US. One of the things that Zoe also found is that in these early childhood education settings in Shanghai, they have a lot of formal guidance for teachers about student attention, professional learning, different guidance that's provided. And so we do think that that impacts directly some of the conversations that she was having with educators, and maybe can lead to some of the differences that we see in their insights. When we talk with middle and high school teachers, we're often hearing things about academic attainment in content domains, so really specific reference to the impact of attention and executive function for a student who's having difficulty with math, for a student who's having difficulty with reading. We also see a lot of emphasis on independent skills for organizing and studying, which makes a lot of sense, right? Because we're trying to transition kids into the world where they're going to have to do a lot of the lift of that self-regulated learning work on their own. So can they manage their materials and make sure that they have what they need for their homework, for example? Do they even know what their homework is? Can they keep a planner together? So really those independent skills for organizing and studying. So we've spoken with a number of educators, particularly in specialty schools for students who have dyslexia, and oftentimes students with dyslexia also have ADHD. So in talking with teachers in these spaces, this is an example of what one educator, a sixth grade English teacher, shared with us. She said, I worked with a kid after school yesterday, and I said, John, have a seat here. And he said, can I stand? And I said, sure. He basically walked the room the whole time, but he was working and he was focused. So I think I always look at movement. Those were when those were my big notices. I think, oh, so-and-so was really active today, like walking to the trash can 5 times during class. Oh, they didn't really interrupt anybody or ask to go to the bathroom 2 or 3 times. Little things like that for me are kind of, ooh, that's a little bit off. Now, if you've worked with middle school students or any students, you have had this experience, right? Somebody getting around the classroom wandering, maybe we're raising our hand a lot because we would like to leave the classroom. So this emphasis, though, on behavior in both cases comes through because those are the noticings that you're able to make in real time with students. And what you see here is a teacher framing that information, that noticing, into something that's really emphasizing what the student is bringing to the table. They were working, they were focused. The behavior isn't always the best symbol as evidenced here, but it is what we see. So when we think about our executive functions, cognitive regulation is a key piece of this. Behavior regulation is another piece of this. And then emotion regulation fits in there as well. Now, initially, when we talked about our definition of EF, I gave you kind of the core component skills, but it really is this triangulation of the behavior, the regulation of cognitive processes, but also in some cases, the emotion regulation that's needed to keep your head in the game. So if you're a student, for example, who's having difficulty with reading, how long can you sit there and inhibit the desire to get out of your seat if you're feeling really anxious or uncomfortable with the fact that you can't do the activity that's being asked of you? So all of these things are happening at once, and they're happening together. And I think this kind of reflects the work of folks studying self-regulation. This is where we get at that link between executive function and self-regulation, at least in my world, or the way I think about it. And I point to this paper by Bailey and Jones, where they describe an integrated model of regulation for applied settings. We also have a recent chapter where we wrote about kind of these different pieces. But I also want to highlight that I kind of dropped the term self-regulated learning a little bit ago. It's also important to note, in my work more recently, I've focused on executive functions and attention, but I also in my work have looked at memory, metacognition, strategy development, and motivation is also a key part of this. So all of these things are happening within the same child at once. And you really see it when you're observing kids' behavior and thinking about not just EF, because it's never just EF, it's all of these things together. So when we take executive function to school, what can you learn from talking to teachers? One of the things that I have taken away from our discussions with educators is that our accuracy and specificity on the research side has practical implications. Educators are asking about diagnosis and intervention strategies. They're also making inferences about skill attribution. Is this something that's about what the kid is bringing to the classroom, or is this something about what I can do to set kids up for success? And that difference kind of matters. We also know that executive function is seen in the context of other skills. So teachers are talking about attention, but they're talking about behavior at the same time. They might also be referencing what motivates kids to pay attention or to keep still or whatever it is that we want them to do. So a question for all of us is to ask, are these other factors also reflected in our tasks or in our models of executive function? We've been thinking a lot about behavior and movement in our work more recently, particularly because of the study of ADHD. And we know that movement matters. It's really related to the development of executive function. So how might we think about that in the context of some of our more specific measures? And as I said, motivation and strategies also matter. For a very long time, I have used this task. It's a go, no go task, a zoo task. It's a gamified version. And the idea is basically that kids are asked, well, even sometimes young adults are asked to press a button when they see an animal, but not when they see one of these 3 cute orangutan friends. And this is a classic go, no go task. It allows us to see, give insight into your skills for response inhibition. Now, just from this task, which I use when we're collecting EEG data, I can get ERP measures and behavioral measures. And I only use this chart not because I'm going to show you any data, but just to say that this is a lot of measures from one task. And most of the time, researchers are just picking one of them. So I might not necessarily be, I might be using, accuracy or one of the many measures of accuracy. I might be pulling one ERP component. But even from this particular task, we have tons of behavioral measures. We have tons of ERP measures. We could also go back, which we've done, and coded kids' behavior. We've coded bids that they make with the experimenter, affective engagement. All of these things are happening, and they all can be important for understanding even how kids are engaging in these very controlled lab tasks. Okay. So what can we learn from observing in classrooms? We know that the experience of going to school impacts students' executive function. We have, and others have demonstrated this using the school cutoff technique, which basically just leverages the birthday deadline that you either make or miss, the cutoff for going to school. In most states in the US, that date is December 1st. So if your birthday is before or after, it has big implications for whether you go to kindergarten or whether you stay back a year. And we know that if we are looking for skills that are impacted by school or school experience, what we would see is that there would be a difference then between our oldest kindergartners, our performance of our oldest kindergartners, and say our youngest first graders. So if kids who are born right around that cutoff, some of them become the oldest kindergartners for their grade, some of them in turn are the youngest, say first graders for their grade, we can look at the difference in their performance. And if we see this kind of split in their performance using regression discontinuity or school cutoff experimental methods, we might attribute the difference in those skills to experience in school. And we have a lot of evidence to suggest that for different components of executive function, and also both for brain and behavioral measures of executive function, the experience of going to school, pre-K, kindergarten, or first grade, depending, is important for EF development. This doesn't tell us what about school matters, but we do have some insight into this and some studies that suggest that features like classroom management, structure, and routine are important for executive functions and self-regulation. Individualized instruction and time in transition. So classrooms that have lower time in transition from one activity to the next. Sometimes you see gains in children's self-regulation across an academic year. We think that that's an indicator of something else that's happening, perhaps in the management, structure, and routine that matters. In some work that I have been doing, we have found that aspects of teacher language during instruction also matters. So teachers who use more metacognitively rich instruction that kind of evidences to the class how thinking and attention might be happening, kind of talking about those types of things a lot, just naturally during regularly occurring lessons and activities. Kids who are in classes where more of that is happening have greater gains in strategy use across the school years, but that's particularly true for kids who have lower self-regulation. So we think that this might be the type of language that's more important for kids who have lower self-regulation. It helps everybody, but might be particularly important for some learners in classrooms. We also know that there are setting issues or setting contextual factors that matter, including kind of the auditory environment and visual input in those environments. I highlight here a couple of papers in MBE, as I said, that I might do, which are really great and definitely worth checking out. So even above and beyond the instructional moves teachers are making, there are some factors that are within our control about classroom settings that might be impacting students' attention as well. So when we're observing in classrooms, what can we learn from observing? We learn that supporting students' executive function involves operating on classroom processes and structures beyond executive function. I work with a lot of schools that are doing discrete training in executive function, but it really seems to be that embedded practice and setting up structures and systems that are working throughout the day that might be offering the most support. So this could inform our thinking about executive function measurement. This inform how we think about the tasks that we're using, the demands of those tasks, the instructions that we use, et cetera. It also gives us insight into something that we all know to be true, which is that the world is multisensory, and our tasks, especially our lab tasks, often are not. So how can we think about measures that actually capture the complexity, or at least kind of induce some of that complexity into our tasks and the assumptions that we make about our tasks? How can we adapt to that real world situation? So at the beginning, I mentioned this kind of notion that expectations for children's behavior are derived from the environment. Context matters, but also development is protracted and challenging for us to measure. It's hard for educators to see. And sometimes when you step back, you can say, oh yeah, this student had a lot of difficulty at the beginning of the year. And by the end of the year, we see this pretty pronounced change in the behavior we would associate with executive functions and attention. But it's hard for us to see. And as a result of that, in a lot of our work, we've also been using neuroscientific methods to dig into what does attention look like in real world settings. Now, another mind-brain education paper that came out of an early emerging field group that I was a part of, where we talk about taking neuroscientific research into the real world. And this is kind of the continuum that we work along. And again, it's kind of this cost benefit. There's always trade-offs that we're making, from lab-based neuroscientific measures to fully naturalistic and semi-naturalistic tasks. But the idea here is to take some of the methods that we might be using in the lab that give us insight into the neural correlates of children's skills and try and put them into settings where we're capturing some of that richness and complexity that I've been alluding to. So for over 15 years, I've been doing EEG work in schools, but more setting up a lab in schools. About 5 years ago, we started collecting EEG data directly in classrooms. And you can see here, these kids actually have EEG caps on underneath some of our pilot work underneath their little caps. And so we've been collecting EEG data in the classroom setting and thinking about different broad kind of characteristics of instruction. So is instruction teacher-led or student-led? Is the learning active? Is it passive? And what are the implications for that? If we kind of experimentally manipulate instruction, what are the implications for that for students' attention? Both thinking about their behavior and also for the neural correlates of those same processes. And I won't get into the weeds of this because I have been taking too long on our time, but we have behavioral measures, including pretty intensive coding of kids' behavior while they're engaged in learning activities. And we're also looking at ERPs and EEG correlates of attention and distraction. And what we have also done is we've started to look at online learning, because during COVID, we couldn't actually be in classrooms and collecting group data, so we had to pivot. And it presented a really nice opportunity to think about that as another real world setting. So when we think about EEG in class, we could ask this question: do behavioral neural correlates of attention differ based on the instructional context kids are in, even those broad strokes of instructional context? And the answer so far has been yes, but these are just EEG plots as a function of the different instructional activities that kids are in: lecture, video watching, group activity, or independent work that kids might be doing. And here you might consider red as less attentive if I were to give you the very broad strokes of this figure. We see that for elementary schoolers and for young adults, watching video is the least attentive period of time during instruction. It's the one that students report liking the best, so that's not that much of a surprise. But basically, the take home in our work in classrooms has been that alpha, or this kind of indicator of attention, is lowest, relating to higher levels of attention when students are engaged in student-led work. And it's highest while kids are engaged in video watching, followed by lecture, indicating that attention is slightly lower. And the impact of experience in lecture is greater for young adults than it is for our younger elementary school students. But behavioral measures pretty consistently show a different pattern, sometimes mapping on to the EEG, sometimes not. And as I mentioned, we've been looking at this with respect to new modes of instruction as well, looking at learning online. But I think the main take-homes or teasers of this, is that, again, these behavioral and neural correlates of attention differ based on instructional context, but that there is some specificity to it, and there are individual differences in the ways that we see this play out. In our studies of Zoom learning, and we're working on this paper right now, we see that really instructional manipulation, so is the instruction teacher-led or student-led? Is it online, in person? How interactive is it? Accounts for a much greater percentage of the variance in kids' behavior than their ADHD symptomatology does. And so this, again, gives us insight into thinking about, A, what are we measuring when we're looking at kids' behavior, but also B, these are things teachers might be able to leverage. So if the instructional context matters for the behavior so much, that's information we can share with educators and maybe help them plan the work that they're doing. So as we kind of wind down here, I'll just end with the teasers for our coming work. We lack precision in our measurement and recommendations for practice, but contexts of learning that support attention are not always the ones that we might expect. So we're trying to dig into that and understand what types of recommendations we might make about types of instruction, length of instruction, in part because we also have this evidence that behavior doesn't always match what's happening underneath the hood. And I use the term match loosely. We also have started to really lean into this idea of how we might study individual differences in executive function. And specifically in our EEG work and ERP work, we're looking at within person variability. So within within participant differences across these instructional contexts versus between participant variability, because it really is that's where we're seeing the most interesting findings. So it's less about, does a child have, say, ADHD or not, and more about how is an individual child looking in these different types of settings, and what are the differences in their behavior across them. So wrapping up the piece about how we're using neuroscience, I don't think anybody is in a place where we're really excited about like this alpha power as the main indicator of attention or executive function, but it's another way of looking at the system of attention, executive function, and what kids are doing in real world settings. And I just will share with you this, and then I'll close.
So very complex. So let's take a closer look. Each part of a neuron has a different job to do. This part is called the
Okay, so you see that student, and he's engaged in online learning activity, right? He's also moving around. He's making emotional expressions with his face. He's probably a little bit bored, right? So this whole system, this is what's happening in real time when kids are also doing the types of things that I might be measuring around executive function and attention. And so right now, we're also engaged in work to capture these other parts of the system: arousal, gaze, body movement, these other things that we think are important, so we can better characterize what's happening for kids in real time. And when we think about what we're taking from the neuroscience, really what we're learning is we're stress testing our assumptions. Not all our ideas are holding up in real world settings, and that's okay. And as I mentioned, we're trying to capture this system because sometimes our existing measures, behavior alone, EEG alone, aren't getting us as close to the phenomenon of interest as we want to be. So on that note, I will go ahead and end, and I will, realizing that we're at time, I'll stop my sharing, and I'm happy to answer any questions that people might have.
That was fantastic. Thank you so much, Jenny. Well, I have a few things I could say, but I can see that Gaia has popped a message in the chat, and she says she has to run for school pickup. So let's get to that quick. So can you expand on your revised model of executive functioning as embedded in activities?
Yeah, no, I think this is a great, that's actually, thank you for that framing, because they are embedded in activities. And there is a control element, but there's also the environment controlling you to some extent, right? And so I think the way that we've been considering this is also something that changes across development. So in early childhood, we expect that maybe there's more happening that's contextualized, that's embedded, that's shaping and working that muscle, and that the control is coming online slowly over time, but that's kind of shift by the emotional valence of something, or by factors of context. I don't know if that makes any sense. It's a dynamic process, and that doesn't necessarily make it any easier for us to study. But sometimes, especially for our littler kids, it isn't so much control yet, right? And so I also owe you an email, so I apologize. Thank you.
Thank you. Thanks, Gaia. That was such a good question. So while everybody else is getting their thoughts together, I'll chime in with mine then. And I kind of wanted to just start off by reflecting one of the reasons I was so keen to invite you to come and share this work, because I think you're asking some really important questions. What is attention in the classroom? How do we know if children are paying attention? And also, how does that attention translate to learning? Because attention doesn't necessarily indicate whether they're understanding or kind of learning. And I guess as I was sitting here reflecting on what you were saying, I realized another part of that conceptual clutter is engagement. So that whole concept, and I noticed in that video, they were going over and they were reinforcing something they'd learned, and it was engaging, it was physical, it was fun, and this one little girl in the front, you probably know the one I mean, caught my attention because she started off laser focused and she was getting it right, and then she was a bit confused and she was sort of, oh, I don't really know what hand each is in, and etc. But, you know, that didn't mean she didn't understand the concept. And I guess the question is, you know, how do these concepts, attention, engagement, how do they interact to promote learning in your experience?
Yeah, I think that's a great question. And there's a question also about interest. I think that it's kind of interesting if you look at the history of executive function research, right? So in motivational research, we focused on engagement and interest. And when you look at the way that we define interest, it involves attention, right? It's like focused attention is a component of this. And so I think that part of it is stepping back and saying, why would we not be considering these things in concert altogether? If I'm working one-on-one with a kid, what I'm doing to get them through an executive function task is I'm getting them engaged and motivated. And if I can't do that, then I actually probably am not going to get them even to give me data to show those skills. So many years ago, when we started doing EEG work with little kids, I was working with someone who is an adult cognitive neuroscientist, and he was like, you can't really do this with kids. So we were videoing as a control for data quality. Could we demonstrate that we could get kids through an assessment? But I had an undergrad who really wanted to code kids' behavior during that time. And what she wanted to get at was like the interactions between the kid and the experimenter. Because when there was more positive affect, the kids were engaged in a different type of way. What did that mean? And it turns out that things that we were coding in terms of that, engagement with the experimenter between the student were related to, say, the error-related negativity, which is thought to be something that's pretty basic and measurable in an ERP component. It gives us insight that it isn't as straightforward as, even though we can measure it in a very clean-cut way, there's always these other factors moving around. And it might not be the same for our undergraduates when they're coming through our lab, but interest, engagement, motivation, we leverage them to get kids through assessments, but we don't include them often in our studies of executive function. Right. So we have some data that show that, for example, motivation isn't enough. Executive functions are also important and a part of that puzzle when we want to see kids' persistence. So how do they work together? How do they work in balance? When might that interest and engagement be enough of a hook that the attention is there for you? And we think about this a lot with kids with ADHD. If you're motivated or interested, I can get you to do something for a lot longer period of time. Well, leveraging that, I'm also stretching that skill for you, right?
Yeah.
So I don't know if that answers your question, but
it's super interesting. It's not an easy topic at all. So I really appreciate you trying to unpick that. So we are just coming up to 5. Can't see any more questions. Oh, hang on. No, Michael, you got in there just at the finish line, and Benjamin as well. I better double check with you, Jenny. Are you able to stay a couple of minutes later? Is that okay? Okay.
yeah.
Right. We've got 3 questions came in right at the finish line. So who do we start with? Let's start with Michael then. So, in practical settings, how important are holistic factors for executive functions? How tired children are, whether they've eaten, whether they've had a physical education class, etc. Hi, Michael.
I think very important. And it's also something that we don't talk about enough, like fatigue, as an example. A lot of times when we are in a classroom, I know this is a big issue here in Los Angeles. There are a number of kids who have not consistent spots to stay. Like they have housing insecurity, like they're coming to school tired. I think that this kind of routine and structure and just kind of the basics related to some of those factors matter more than we recognize or more than we give credit to. We do also have, so if you're tired and paying attention is challenging for you, it's work, right? And we know that for kids, especially, I think we've seen this more and more coming out of COVID, even for adults, you sit through a day of stuff where you're supposed to be paying attention and you're focused, and it feels like you're tired at the end of the day because it's active. And for some of us, it's more active than for others. We have new rules here in California about recess, in part with this recognition that kids need time outside and they need to be moving around because that is impacting how they are engaged in the classroom. And anxiety is a huge factor, right? So all of these things matter. And sometimes the basics matter, as I said, more than we're always focused on like, how do we teach teachers to do these different things? But sometimes it's stuff that's pretty straightforward. Like if you're tired, you're probably not able to pay attention for 7 hours, right?
Yeah.
Yeah.
Satisfied. We've got a thumbs up, so that's good. Thank you, Michael. Okay, well, we've got Benjamin. Have you an example of the discrete instruction used in schools to develop EF?
In terms of the types of things that some of the particularly independent schools are doing, I just to clarify, I think in some schools, folks have these like blocks of the day where they're talking with students about executive function, and most of it's like study skills related, routine related. And so less specific, like the types of brain training sometimes folks do, and more like, let's talk about study skills, but couched as executive function. Which is an interesting approach because that's definitely important. But a lot of times the more foundational things you can also work on, embedded in context. So for some kids, that decontextualization, it makes it hard to wrap it around to translate that to their everyday work. Yeah.
Very interesting. So Jonathan says, first of all, love how translational multimodal your research is. May I ask if you've explored functional EEG connectivity across the students or the teacher child?
So if by that you're referencing like kind of synchrony, in our work, in our work, we haven't looked at that quite as much, in part because we're kind of making this assumption that there's a lot of individual differences that we're interested in, but that's just an orientation that we have. I am working with some folks that are looking at synchrony, more student to teacher in those one-on-one interactions, and I think that there's more kind of bang for your buck there, because there is something about the reciprocity and the cadence of an interaction that probably matters a lot. But that's not something we've specifically focused on in our work. Yeah. Thank you.
Thank you, Jenny. I think we'll just do one more because this is quite an interesting one from Yola. So Yola says it's about age effects. So your EG experiments show engagement in younger children's higher in group, while in the older group, engagement's higher when they work independently. Does that mean that potential EF interventions in young children should be done in the classroom and for older learners one-to-one? Does that make sense?
Yeah, no, and actually, because I kind of zipped through that section, I should say one of the things that we see in our older group is actually that attention is pretty high in these kind of group peer-to-peer settings. That aligns with what we would expect in adolescence, right? So, and late adolescence, emerging adulthood, which is kind of great. And I think we don't see that as cleanly with the younger kids. So there are implications, right? But they're not, it's so funny because it's not that different than what I would recommend anyway, just what we know about adolescents. Like adolescents are going to be working differently when they're working with groups. Maybe that's more engaging. I can't say from my data if it's more engaging what they're working on or engaging with each other, because attention that we're measuring with our EEG or kind of the neural correlate index that we have is not going to tell us, am I paying attention to the learning activity or am I paying attention to the person across from me that I'm really trying to make friends with, right? But I do think there's meaning to be made about, group size, length of activity, what's developmentally appropriate. One of the things that I think is really fascinating when I'm talking with educators, their understanding of what should kids be able to, what is development and what are the implications of children's development for the moves I might be making? And this is a classic example where there are developmental differences, and we can hopefully provide more information about how to leverage those developmental differences most effectively too.
I think that is such a great place to finish. So thank you for such a fantastic talk, for answering all these questions in such a erudite and wonderful way. And thank you all for coming and for asking your questions. So next week we actually have another Jenny. So we have Jennie Bullen. I think I saw Jenny in the chat as well. So see you next week. And Jenny's going to be telling us about factors in math outcomes for neurodivergent students. So that is also going to be very interesting. But thank you again to Jenny for a wonderful, wonderful talk. Thank you.
Thanks so much for having me. I really appreciate it.
Thank you, Jenny. Hope to see you again in the future.
Thank you so much, Jenny.